Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for letting me present in this way. I'm Billy Riggs, author of the paper entitled Street Livability and Beautification in the Era of Disruptive Transport. The idea to look at autonomy and develop policies and principles for practice with my colleague, Bruce Appleyard from San Diego State University. I have a partner who is a vulnerable condition, as well as two kids that are now going to school from home. So really appreciate this opportunity to present to you in this way. So without further ado, Billy Riggs, my email is wriggs@usfca.edu. I'm at the wonderful University of San Francisco, having been at Cal Poly and UC Berkeley and San Jose State in past lives. My colleague Bruce Appleyard, Appleyard at mail.sdsu.edu is at San Diego State. First off, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about our presentation or want to dialogue anything. We'll start off by saying, Bruce and I have been working on a lot of this for quite a while. Bruce has been worked with some of his father's material, Don Appleyard, and his new book, Livable Streets 2.0, is available on Amazon and other places where you get books. I have a forthcoming piece of work that was 10 years in the making about the evolution of street design and how we can reimagine what we think of streets. It's called Into the Road from Bristol Press, and that'll be out in May. A link to both of those is available on our social feeds, as well as we can provide those to you via email. They're here in this slide. But a lot of it that builds on work by Don Appleyard, Don Jacobs, Kevin Lynch, Christopher Alexander. The idea of kind of the image of the city and what we can do to really think about streets as a part of that city and the livability of that city, the beautification of that city. So we start off with kind of this idea of how do we move towards, as we're moving towards automation. And I think there's a lot of speculation at TRB this year from what I've seen. It's kind of, what is the year? What can we do to control the technology? And I'll just say, like, the tech's happening. I focus more on kind of how cities can be assertive, how civil engineer and the engineering practice can think about design in a way that actually frames the technological operations and frames new platforms, new behaviors, new opportunities, and new policies. And so I'm going to start with that. But let's talk about some background first. I'm going to run through this. It's really dense. There's a lot there, but I think it's good foundation for what we're doing. And I'm going to try to go fast because I have a lot of material here. But our paper, which is available, and I'll provide it's actually a bit.ly link that it says AVs and street beautification. I'll provide that at the end for anybody who wants to look at it. It contains all this material as well. Lots of dialogue, and I'll say it, speculation on automation. And Bruce and I try not to do a lot of speculation, because it's not just about automation and cars. It is about uncertainty and hyperloop and flying vehicles and scooter-geddon. And, we can say it's a revolution. It's not about the car. We have to rethink the curb dramatically, given that this stuff is coming. And I've spent a lot of time working with industry and trying to document, well, when is it coming? And the fact is that we just don't know. Some of the best estimates we're saying, and Tesla believes this year we're going to have that tech, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. I did spend with Sven Baker. There's a paper. I'm happy to provide it afterwards. We very clearly are at what we call level 3 technology, where there's limited situations, for example, Tesla Autopilot, where we can actually have assisted driving. Sven Baker and I actually, when we look at business models, we try to basically talk about proliferation and times buckets. And so right now, here we are, 2020, 21, 22. For the next 5 years, we're probably going to see a lot of transit pilots and fleet deployments. Pardon the spelling there, but following that, let's go 2026 to 2027 to 2030. Increasing proliferation and potential for shared and maybe privately owned AVs. We don't know just yet, and our planning now will frame that. because, I think there are capacity reasons why we want this. There's literature that says as much as 300% roadway capacity increase. But also just kind of this idea of ease of travel. And I always hold up these crazy devices, these crazy computers when I say this, because it really, there's an opportunity for using tech to actually increase travel. Now, increase travel as a whole, to grow the pie. And I think that's what we saw if we look at kind of what happened with rideshare, changed the game, right? It wasn't just this fighting over this small pie of trips. What happened was we actually increased the entire demand for travel. And that's why that's really important, is because we had latent demand. And to a certain degree, when we talk about BMT and we think about BMT, it's important that we weren't meeting all our needs, particularly for youth and the elderly. And I think that's important. When we think about writing substitutes, there's literature from Regina Clulo, from Giovanni Turcella, and Farid Farzad Alemi, that just talk about kind of this idea that there were populations that were underserved, that were had a limited accessibility, and it's not just a apples to apples comparison to say that, for example, rideshare and sharing gobbled up all these trips. And why that's important for automation is because we have these case studies out there that talk about this idea of trip replacement, that there really is this niche for vehicles that may be driven, maybe not driven, maybe autonomous, to actually fill, whether or not it's the last mile. So this Austin case study is really fascinating. Basically, when TNCs came in, a lot of people switched to TNCs, but they forced TNCs to leave. And what happened was they actually switched to another rideshare. And it was actually a city sponsor. It's called Ride Austin. Really fascinating study by one of our now new DOT representatives, Rob Hampshire. Check it out if you haven't seen it. And then, of course, Lisa Real, Bob Severo, and Susan Shaheen did this paper that it basically talked about kind of this idea of why do people choose this kind of new form of transit, whether or not it's autonomous or not. And it's basically, I say convenience, reliability, ease of payment, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's stuff that transit, let's face it, is broken in many ways, and automation may provide a way for us to fix this, but also may provide a way where we can complement that. I'll come back to that in a couple slides, but it's important to understand this from policy context in terms of how policy for TNC adoption came in. You saw basically a lot of this stuff happening at the state level with 4 or 5 states to start off with, and then from 2012 to 2017, you had basically all of this coming down from the state. So now we have for AVs, what we have is a lot of federal guidance on operational domains, but basically pilots that are established by the state. Here is California. I like to feel like I'm in California a leader, but other states are doing this similar in terms of permits issued. There are a limited number of drivered and driverless pilots, and there's a debate between Cruise and Waymo about who's in the lead, but we've got to say that Cruise Automation right now is the only one with both a drivered autonomous pilot and a driverless pilot right now. Waymo has a driver pilot or a safety driver still in the vehicle. And you can see here, so we have here is basically 13 companies that are, pardon my counting, I didn't count this before, 10 companies that are out there with these kinds of pilots in California. And it's between California and Arizona. I think those are the leaders in terms of permits. But I think what we're seeing here is most of that is regulated at the state level. This is the point there. When some of the formative work that I've done shows that very, very little local policy, and particularly very little built environment policy. About 2 years ago, we were showing that only 12% had local AV policy. Most of it was, I classified as is it in the general plan? And yes, does it mention it, but it's not real policy. And by and large, what we're seeing is, yes, a mention of AVs is basically what we're seeing right now. A lot of people, a lot of cities had white papers at that point. This data has probably changed at that point, but it's a really good benchmark for understanding at the local level, still a lot of opportunity to frame, what are we doing with our built environment? What are we doing with design of our roadways, of our landscapes? Just another way of looking at this data based on location. I think that on the West Coast, we tend to we tend to be sometimes a bit smug about, we're doing the most in this space, but I always find it fast. And I have a lot of colleagues at Florida State that are really leading in this area. We wrote the APA guidance on this. APA, I think it's Planning Policy Guidance 528 on autonomous vehicles with my colleagues at Florida State. And we see here that the South, I'm from Kentucky, I can say that South definitely leading along with the West in terms of at least getting out there with a mention in a general plan or some places doing ordinances. This piece of work I could share, we have a little more detail on what they're seeing, but it's important to come back. I said I'd mentioned this before. Cruise actually is put a permit in to actually begin a driverless pilot in a limited area. And so basically, when we say I showed the timeline, we're seeing that there will be snapshots and geofenced areas where we can actually explore some of this area. I think it's interesting to know here, Cruise is actually really trying to be responsive to roadways that were safe streets and were classified as slow streets during the pandemic. So those are indicated in red on or yellow on this map, which is the part of their application to the California Public Utilities Commission. And they're excluding those areas from their driverless pilot. And I think that's an interesting policy gesture they're putting forward. And it's something that cities haven't necessarily been assertive on. How do we zone our streets for autonomous or smart vehicle access? I think it's a really provocative thing that we now see a private company putting out there as a signpost or a benchmark. And this is from that Planning Policy Guidance 528. We see here, the opportunity here is clear, opportunities to reframe streets. So let's talk about the policy framework that Bruce and I put forward in our paper. We classify it on 3 key areas. First off, this idea of vehicles technologies, and that's leveraging technology to basically incentivize certain types of travel, healthy travel. Streets and users, that's the core of this committee, looking at beautification, livability, environmental design. I've spent a lot of time on that. And then also, finally, just if we step above that, a lot of this is framed by the transportation and land use connection. And so looking at transportation, land use, and livability, and the way that we can reconnect those and refill, and particularly, I'm not going to talk about this a lot because it's, this would be a different talk, but housing is a part of this, and parking is a part of this. My wife gave me this book for Christmas, Tiny Houses, big advocate of rethinking housing and accessory dwelling units, but that, when we think about landscape, we think of design, would be another talk. So let's talk first, this bucket of vehicles and technology. I said, transit pilots are going to be kind of the first thing. Lots of opportunities to rethink the way we're doing curbside service. Mark Schlossberg and Elizabeth Shea and Adam Miller-Ball and I, a couple years ago, as a part of an Urbanism Next initiative, really thought about this idea of thinning lanes, removing parking, and thinking shared. And that's when when Bruce and I were doing this review and classifying policy. This is a really simple way in terms of looking at safe, slow, and sustainable streets that we can begin to think about design. We thought about this as an erosion problem. How can we erode the public right-of-way? And then what can we do with it? I'll come back to that. I think part of this is thinking about new behaviors, thinking about how can we think about transit partnerships to enable those behaviors. There's this separate piece of work that I've just been working on, and there's a poster that Anurag Pandey I have as one of separate paper about accessible autonomous vehicles, which is another thing where when we go back and we think about, okay, well, if there's a new way to think about streets and using streets, maybe some of those streets could be autonomous shuttle streets. So they could be the streets of Barcelona that have been shut down to cars, but only accessible will be these handicap accessible autonomous vehicles. This is available as an MTI report as well as a separate TRB paper focused on automation. But what Anurag and I found, which really complements what is in Bruce and I's paper, this idea for operational efficiency, looking at curbside maximization, investing in physical infrastructure. I say signs, lines, and potholes. and really looking at transforming potential auto-serving uses, but also looking at demand planning. How do we consider LOS? Where does, you know, some research based on some research that Farron Pierce and I did a couple of years ago, you know, can we classify what is our backbone? And so if we highlight what's in purple on the right side of your screen here, maybe that's your backbone, but what can be shared and what can be crowdsourced? Maybe we have traditional transit serves what's circled in blue, but then we actually have more, you know, neighborhood-based services that actually serve in those green areas. And so could we have a reprioritization of transit priorities? The Dutch government are actually doing this at the national level. A couple of years ago, I had some students there and they were thinking about, how can we think about when people make that decision to get in their car, can we rethink the way that they would move on national roadways? And they're looking at TDM at the point of departure. Can we actually send out behavioral nudges that engage people, that engage users early on? So harness the technology to actually reduce the people that actually are choosing to be on road, whether or not they're in an automated or autonomous vehicle. And of course, if we build on this, there's opportunities to rethink transportation demand management or behavioral nudge programs dramatically. I spent a lot of time on this early on in my academic career, looking at like marketing programs and badging programs. And the fact is, they work. I mean, like, so, you know, we need to revisit a lot of these behavioral nudge programs as a part of what we do as transportation professionals. We fail to look at a lot of behavioral economics many times. So, you know, bringing it back to that graphic that Mark and Adam and Elizabeth and I did, I think it's important to really focus on the physical design. And the physical design does relate to the tech and the behavior. That's why I showed it before, but I want to really dive deep on this idea of how do we reframe physical design. HOK has put out some kind of radical, glossy stuff. We included this graphic in some of our work. But you know, well, sometimes I actually think about, you know, maybe the reality is actually more of what we're doing incrementally through COVID. This is from San Francisco Planning Department. You know, basically says, hey, we're doing this now incrementally. We're through our safe streets, our slow streets programs, where we're shutting streets down to traffic and basically giving that space over to pedestrians. Now, how can we design the built environment to even facilitate this more? I think that's the question. So when we go back to this kind of work that Mark and I did, you know, maybe there's a design opportunity to transform beauty and beautify locally. And maybe it is in this idea of thinking shared stuff. And I'm going to go back to that. We thought about kind of a traditional neighborhood street as being 2 drive lanes, 24 feet plus 2, you know, 9, let's call it 9 to 12 foot parking lanes. So, and I think embarrassingly, a 50 to 60 foot right of way in most cities is not an anomaly for a residential street. And that's a shame to start off with. I'm just going to put that out there because I don't need that much space in a residential area. That's a very 1950s suburban way of thinking about physical infrastructure and drive lanes. So what if we just, you know, turn that on its head? What if we thin lanes? So, you know, what if we just said, wow, we don't need that much space. People, you know, if computers are driving, they could drive in probably a 6 foot lane. The average vehicle 6 feet. Maybe there's enough. Maybe they actually don't need 2 lanes. Maybe they could just be in one way and yield one another. And I'm the two-way street conversion guy. If you know my work, so it's really provocative for me to say that. So, you know, if you just actually took away a parking lane and thin the lanes, what happens is you end up on this section. You end up with like all this empty space. How you reprogram that? We don't even have to say that. How do you? But just, you know, we don't have to tell people how. But from a zonal approach, and I'm saying that, anchoring to that word zonal, what happens then? What if you just said, you know, we don't need to do on-street parking. We can figure out other ways to rethink parking. 26 feet in this, you know, roughly 50-foot section that we had. You know, so what do we do with that additional? Is that become pedestrian space, a play space, gardens, natural space? Lots of opportunity. And then you go to the radical. Let's think about Barcelona. You know, maybe we could do a 30-foot planting strip. And of course, I showed a picture before that was like there was one drive lane. But I think, slow streets could be a catalyst to how we get here, in terms of maybe there's one shared lane in this green space, or maybe every other street has a planting strip. But I think there's time that, the landscape architects and urban designers can start to nudge civil engineers to rethink networks as well. And how can these networks, function better, but also facilitate non-automotive travel? Bruce and I actually, in our paper, we talk about this idea of, if you have a certain right-of-way, prioritize it based on mode and prioritize it based on speed. So we have this zonal approach where you think about safe, slow, and sustainable. Maybe there's an opportunity to think about speed and width at the same way, but also to separate those modes to facilitate those. And so we provide that, something we worked on with a landscape architecture colleague, Michael Johnson, a friend of mine from undergrad at Ball State. We've been gradually shopping and getting it out there over time. Enough on that. The last bucket is a lot of this. You can't do this without the regional construct, without kind of thinking bigger than just the local. So our regions do have a role. San Francisco, we anchor a lot of this idea of preserving our classic buildings here. And in honor of Bob Saget, I'm actually putting this out there, as an example of local land use and design. But we can actually realign transportation and land use. Bruce has done a lot of thinking about this with his transportation and land use livability calculator. But we need to address the imbalance between land use plans. At the same time, this gives us an opportunity to think regionally about kind of this idea of, well, in California, we've been thinking a lot about these ideas and nodes around transit. And I work with Peter Calthorpe. I've been talking with him a lot about this. This actually builds on some stuff that he did with Urban Footprint. And he and Joe DiStefano really did some work on something called SB50, where they were thinking about these priority areas around existing transit areas. This actually was around Caltrain in our region, which is a diesel train that will be electrified. And what Peter has talked about, and what I have spent a lot of time talking with him about, is maybe autonomous pods or autonomous transit pods. And he didn't want to call them autonomous vehicles, and I understand that, Peter, so sorry. But maybe it gives us an opportunity to rethink the way those networks work. Maybe they actually function more like networks and less like these circular catchment areas, which is our traditional way we thought about DOD. So I think that's a really interesting place to kind of end our conversation. If you want to know more, Bruce and I, again, a lot of kind of the way we've been thinking about this is in our books, but it's also in this paper. Our paper is available at this link, bit.ly, AV Street Beautification. I think I've spelled all that right. Our emails are here, wriggs@usfca.edu, bappeleyard@mail.sdsu.edu. Happy to answer any questions. And really, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present to you via video. I'm really bummed that I didn't have an opportunity to be there and to talk with you one-on-one. So all the best, stay safe, wear a mask, and get vaccinated.